A Critical History of Greek Philosophy, Chapter 18, Chapter V, Heraclitus. Heraclitus was born about 535 BC and is believed to have lived to the age of 60. This places his death at 475 BC. He was the subsequent to Xenophanes, contemporary with Parmenides, and older than Zeno. In historical order of time, therefore, he runs parallel to Eleatics. Heraclitus was a man of Ephesus in Asia Minor. He was an aristocrat, descendant of a noble Ephesian family, and occupied in Ephesus the nominal positions of basileus or king. This, however, merely meant that he was the chief priest of the local branch of the Eleusinian mysteries, and this position he resigned in favor of his brother. He appears to have been a man of somewhat aloof, solitary, and scornful nature. He looked down not only upon the common herd, but even upon the great men of his own race. He mentions Xenophanes and Pythagoras in terms of obloquy. Homer, he thinks, should be taken out and wiped. He said he considers to be the teacher of the common herd, one with them, a man, he says, who does not even know day and night. Upon the common herd of mortals he looks down with infinite scorn. Some of his sayings remind us not a little of Schopenhauer in their poignancy and sharpness. Asses prefer straw to gold. Dogs bark at everyone they do not know. Many of his sayings, however, are memorable and trenchant epitomes of practical wisdom. Man's character is his fate. Physicians who cut, burn, stab, and rag the sick demand a fee for doing it, which they do not deserve to get. From his aloof and aristocratic standpoint, he launched forth denunciations against the democracy of Ephesus. Heraclitus embodied his philosophical thoughts in a prose treatise which was well known at the time of Socrates, but of which only fragments have come down to us. His style soon became proverbial for its difficulty and obscurity, and he gained his nickname of Heraclitus the Dark or the Obscure. Socrates said of his work that what he understood of it was excellent, what not he believed was equally so, but that the book required a tough swimmer. He has even been accused of intentional obscurity, but there does not seem to be any foundation for this charge. The fact is that if he takes no great trouble to explain his thoughts, neither does he take any trouble to conceal them. He does not write for fools. His attitude appears to be that if his readers understand him, well, if not so much, the worse for his readers. He wastes no time in elaborating and explaining his thought, but embodies it in short, terse, pithy, and pregnant sayings. His philosophical principle is the direct antithesis of Eleaticism. The Eleatics had taught that only being is and becoming is not at all. All change, all becoming is mere illusion. For Heraclitus, on the contrary, only becoming is and being, permanence, identity, these are nothing but illusion. All things sublunary are perpetually changing, passing over into new forms and new shapes. Nothing stands, nothing holds fast, nothing remains what it is. Into the same river, he says, we go down and we do not go down. For into the same river no man can enter twice, ever it flows in and flows out. Not only does he deny all absolute permanence, but even a relative permanence of things is declared to be illusory. We all know that everything has its term, that all things arise and pass away, from the insects who live an hour to the eternal heats. Yet we commonly attribute to these things at least a relative permanence, a shorter or longer continuance in the same state. But even this Heraclitus will not allow. Nothing is ever the same. Nothing remains identical from one consecutive moment to another. The appearance of relative permanence is an illusion, like that which makes us think that our wave passing over the surface of the water remains all the time the same identical wave. Here, as we know, the water of which the wave is composed changes from moment to moment, only the form remaining the same. Precisely so, for Heraclitus, the permanent appearance of things results from the inflow and outflow in them of equivalent quantities of substance. All is flux. It is not, for example, the same sun which sets today and rises tomorrow. It is a new sun, for the fire of the sun burns itself out and it is replenished from the vapors of the sea. Not only do things change from moment to moment, even in one and the same moment, they are and are not the same. It is not merely that a thing first is and then a moment afterwards it's not. It both is and is not at the same time. The at onceness is and is not is the meaning of becoming. We shall understand this better if we contrast it with the Eleatic principle. The Eleatics described all things under two concepts, being and not being. Being has for them all truth, all reality. Not being is wholly false and illusory. For Heraclitus, both being and not being are equally real. The one is as true as the other. Both are true, for both are identical. Becoming is the identity of being and not being. For becoming has only two forms, namely the arising of things and their passing away, the beginning and their end, their origination and their disease. Perhaps you may think that this is not correct, that there are other forms of change besides origination and disease. A man is born, that is his origination. He dies, that is his disease. Between his birth and his death, there are intermediate changes. He grows larger, grows older, grows wiser or more foolish. His hair turns grey. So also the leaf of a tree does not merely come into being and pass out of being. It changes in shape, form, color. From light green it becomes dark green, and from dark green yellow. But there is after all nothing in all this except origination and disease, not of the thing itself, but of its qualities. The change from green to yellow is the disease of green color. The origination of yellow color, origination is the passage of not being into being. Disease is the passage of being into not being. Becoming then has it only the two factors of being and not being, and it means the passing of one into the other. But this passage does not mean for Heraclitus that at one moment there is being and at the next moment not being. It means that being and not being are in everything at one and the same time. Being is not being. Being has not being in it. Take as an example the problem of life and death. Ordinarily, we think that death is due to external causes such as accident or disease. We consider that while life lasts, it is what it is and remains what it is, namely life unmixed with death, and that it does on being life until something comes from outside, as it were, in the shape of external causes and puts an end to it. You may have read Metchnikoff's book, The Nature of Man. In the course of that book, he develops this idea. Death, he says, is always due to external causes. Therefore, if we could remove the causes, we could conquer death. The cause of death are mostly disease and accident, for even old age is disease. There is no reason why science should not advance so far as to eliminate disease and accident from life. In that case, life might be made immortal, or at any rate indefinitely prolonged. Now, this is founded upon a confusion of ideas. No doubt, death is always due to external causes. Every event in the world is determined and wholly determined by causes. The law of causation admits of no exception whatever. Therefore, if it perfectly true that in every case of death causes preceded, but as I explained in the last chapter, footnote 6, to give the cause is not to give any reason for an event. Causation is never a principle of explanation of anything. It tells us that the phenomenon A is invariably and unconditionally followed by the phenomena B, and we call A the cause of B. But that only means that whenever B happens, it happens in a certain regular order and succession of events. But it does not tell us why B happens at all. The reason of a thing is to be distinguished from its cause. The reason why a man dies is not to be found in the causes which bring about his death. The reason rather is that life has the germ of death already in it, that life is already death potentially, that being has not being in it. The causation of death is merely the mechanism by the instrumentality of which, through one set of causes or another, the inevitable end is brought about. Not only is being for Heraclitus identical with not being, but everything in the universe has in it its own opposite. Every existent thing is a harmony of opposite tensions. A harmony contains necessarily two opposite principles which, in spite of their opposition, reveal an underlying unity. That it is by virtue of this principle that everything in the universe exists is the teaching of Heraclitus. All things contain their own opposites within them. In the struggle and antagonism between hostile principles consists their life, their being, their very existence. At the heart of things is conflict. If there were no conflict in a thing, it would cease to exist. This idea is expressed by Heraclitus in a variety of ways. Strife, he says, is the father of all things. The one, sundering from itself, coalesces with itself, like the harmony of bow and the lyre. God is day and night, summer and winter, war and peace, satiety and hunger, joined together whole and unwhole, congruous and incongruous, accordant and discordant, then comes from one all and from all one. In this sense, too, he censures Homer for having prayed that strife might cease from among gods and men. If such a prayer were granted, the universe itself would pass away. Side by side with the metaphysics, Heraclitus lays down a theory of physics. All things are composed of fire. This world, he says, neither one of the gods nor of the human race has made, but it was, and ever shall be an eternally living fire. All comes from fire, and fire all returns. All things are exchanged from fire, and fire for all, as wares for gold, and gold for wares. Thus, there is only one ultimate kind of matter, fire, and all other forms of matter are merely modifications and variations of fire. It is clear for what reason Heraclitus enunciated this principle. It is an exact physical parallel to the metaphysical principle of becoming. Fire is the most mutable of the elements. It does not remain the same from one moment to another. It is continually taking up matter in the form of fuel and giving off equivalent matter in the form of smoke and vapor. The primal fire, according to Heraclitus, transmutes itself into air, air into water, and water into earth. This he calls the downward path. To it corresponds the upward path. The transmutation of earth into water, water to air, and air to fire. All transformation takes place in this regular order, and therefore, says Heraclitus, the upward and the downward path are one. Fire is further specially identified with life and reason. It is a rational element in things. The more fire there is, the more life, the more movement. The more dark and heavy materials there are, the more death, cold and not being. The soul accordingly is fire, and like all other fires, it continually burns itself out and needs replenishment. This it obtains through the sense and the breath from the common life and reason of the world, that is, from the surrounding and all pervading fire. In this we live and move and have our being. No man has a separate soul of his own. It is merely part of the one universal soul fire. Hence, if communication with this is cut off, man becomes irrational and finally dies. Sleep is the halfway house to death. In sleep, the passages of the senses are stopped up, and the outer fire reaches us only through breath. Hence, in sleep, we become irrational and senseless. Turning aside from the common life of the world, each to a private world of his own, Heraclitus taught also the doctrine of periodic world cycles. The world forms itself out of fire and by conflagration passes back to the primitive fire. In his religious opinions, Heraclitus was skeptical, but he does not, like Xenophanes, direct his attacks against the central ideas of religion and the doctrine of the gods. He attacks mostly the outward observances and forms in which the religious spirit manifests itself. He inveighs against the worship of images and urges the uselessness of blood sacrifice. With the Eleatics, he distinguishes between sense and reason and places truth in rational cognition. The illusion of permanence he describes to the senses. It is by reason that we rise to the knowledge of the law of becoming. In the comprehension of this law lies the duty of man and the only road to happiness. Understanding this, man becomes resigned and contented. contented. He sees that evil is the necessary counterpart of good and pain necessary counterpart of pleasure, and the both together are necessary to form the harmony of the world. Good and evil are principles on the struggle between which the very existence of things depends. Evil too is necessary, has its place in the world. To see this is to put oneself above pitiful and fertile struggles against the supreme law of the universe. Chapter 19, Chapter 6, Empedocles. Empedocles was a man of Agrigentum in Sicily. The dates of his birth and death are placed about 495 and 435 BC, respectively. Like Pythagoras, he possessed a powerful and magnetic personality. Hence, all kinds of legends quickly grew up and wove themselves round his life and death. He was credited with the performance of miracles, and romantic stories were circulated about his death. A man of much persuasive eloquence, he raised himself to the leadership of Agrigentine democracy until he was driven out into exile. The philosophy of Empedocles is Eleatic in character. Greek philosophy had now developed a variety of conflicting principles, and the task of Empedocles is to reconcile these and to weld them together in a new system, containing, however, no new thought of his own. In speaking of Parmenides, I pointed out that his teaching may be interpreted either in an idealistic or a materialistic sense, and that these two aspects of thought lie side by side in Parmenides, and that it is possible to emphasize either the one or the other. Empedocles seizes upon the materialistic side. The essential thought of Parmenides was that being cannot pass into not being, nor not being into being. Whatever is remains forever what it is. If we take that in a purely material context, what it means is that matter has neither beginning nor end, is uncreated and indestructible. And this is the first basic principle of Empedocles. On the other hand, Heraclitus had shown that becoming and change cannot be denied. This is the second basic principle of Empedocles, that there is no absolute becoming, no creation, and utter destruction of things, and yet that things do somehow arise and pass away. This must be explained. This contradictory ideas must be reconciled. Now, if we assert that matter is uncreated and indestructible, and yet that things arise and pass away, there is only one way of explaining this. We must suppose that objects as wholes begin and cease to be, but that the material particles of which they are composed are uncreated and indestructible. This thought now forms the first principle of Empedocles and of the successors, Anaxagoras and the atomists. Now the Ionic philosophers had taught that all things are composed of some one ultimate matter. Thales believed it to be water, Anaximenes air. This necessarily involves that the ultimate kind of matter must be capable of transformation into other kinds of matter. If it is water, then water must be capable of turning into brass, wood, iron, air, or whatever other kind of matter exists. And the same thing applies to the air of Anaximenes. Parmenides, however, had taught that whatever is remains always the same, no change or transformation being possible. Empedocles here too follows Parmenides and integrates his doctrine in his own way. One kind of matter he thinks can never change into another kind of matter. Fire never becomes water, nor does earth become air. This leads Empedocles at once to a doctrine of elements. The word elements in the deed is of later invention, and Empedocles speaks of elements as the roots of all. There are four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Empedocles was therefore the originator of the familiar classification of four elements. All other kinds of matter are to be explained as mixtures in various proportions of these four. Thus, all origination and disease, as well as the differential qualities of certain kinds of matter, are now explained by the mixture and unmixing of the four elements. All becoming is simply composition and decomposition. But the coming together and separation of the elements involves the movement of particles, and to explain this, there must exist some moving force. The Ionic philosophers had assumed that matter has the power or force required for movement immanent in itself. The air of Anaximenes, of its own inherent power, transforms itself into other kinds of matter. This doctrine Empedocles rejects. Matter is for him absolutely dead and lifeless, without any principle of motion in itself. This is therefore only one remaining possibility: forces acting upon matter from the outside must be assumed, and as the two essential processes of the world, mixing and unmixing, are opposite in character, so there must be two opposite forces. These he calls by the names love and hate, or harmony and discord. Though these terms may have an idealistic sound, Empedocles conceives them as entirely physical and material forces. But he identifies the attractions and repulsions of human beings, which we call love and hate, with the universally operating forces of the material world. Human love and the hate are but the manifestations in us of the mechanical forces of attraction and repulsion at work in the world at large. Empedocles taught the doctrine of periodic world cycles. The world process is, therefore, properly speaking, circular and has neither beginning nor end. But in describing this process, one must begin somewhere. We will begin then with the spheros, sphere. In the primeval sphere, the four elements are completely mixed and interpenetrate each other completely. Water is not separated off from air, nor air from earth. All are chaotically mixed together. In any portion of the sphere, there must be an equal quantity of earth, air, fire, and water. The elements are thus in union, and the sole force operative within the sphere is love and harmony. Hence, the sphere is called a blessed God. Hate, however, exists all around the outside of the sphere. Hate gradually penetrates from the circumference towards the center and introduces the process of separation and disunion of the elements. This process continues till, like coming together with like, the elements are wholly separated. All the water is together, all the fire is together, and so on. When this process of this integration is complete, hate is supreme, and love is entirely driven out. But love again begins to penetrate matter, to cause union and mixture of the elements, and finally brings the world back to the state of the original sphere. Then the same process begins again. At what position is the circular movement is our present world to be placed? This answer is that it is neither in the complete union of the sphere nor is it completely disintegrated. It is halfway between the sphere and the stage of total disintegration. It is proceeding from the former towards the latter. And hate is gradually gaining the upper hand. In the formation of the present world from the sphere, the first element to be separated off was air, next fire, then earth. Water is squeezed out of the earth by the rapidity of its rotation. The sky is composed of two halves. One is of fire, and this is the day. The other is dark matter with masses of fire scattered about in it, and this is the night. Empedocles believed in the transmigration of souls. He also put forward a theory of sense perception, the essential of which is that like perceives like. The fire in us perceives external fire, and so with the other elements. Sight is caused by influences of the fire and water of the eyes meeting similar affluences from external objects. Chapter 20, Chapter 7. The Atomists. The founder of the atomist philosophy was Leucippus. Practically nothing is known of his life. The date of his birth, the date of his death, and the place of residence are alike unknown, but it is believed that he was a contemporary of Empedocles and Anaxagoras. Democritus was a citizen of Abdera in Thrace. He was a man of the widest learning, as learning was understood in his day. A passion for knowledge and the possession of adequate means for the purpose determined him to undertake extensive travels in order to acquire the wisdom and knowledge of other nations. He traveled largely in Egypt, also probably in Babylonia. The date of his death is unknown, but he certainly lived to a great age, estimated at from 90 to 100 years. Exactly what were the respective contributions of Leucippus and Democritus to the atomist philosophy is also a matter of doubt, but it is believed that all the essentials of his philosophy were the work of Leucippus, and the Democritus applied and extended them, worked out details, and made them theory famous. Now we saw that the philosophy of Empedocles was based upon the attempt to reconcile the doctrine of permanence with the doctrine of Heraclitus. The fundamental thought of Empedocles was that there is no absolute becoming in the strict sense, no passage of being into not being or not being into being. Yet the objects of the senses do in some way arise and pass away, and the only method by which this is capable of explanation is to suppose that objects as whole objects come to be and cease to be, but that the material particles of which they are composed are eternally existent. But the detailed development which Empedocles gave to the principle was by no means satisfactory. In the first place, if we hold that all objects are composed of parts and that all becoming is due to the mixing and unmixing of pre-existing matter, we must have a theory of particles. And we do hear vaguely of physical particles in the doctrine of Empedocles, but no definition is given of their nature and no clear conception is formed of their character. Secondly, the moving forces of Empedocles, love and hate, are fanciful and mythological. Lastly, though there are in Empedocles traces of the doctrine that the qualities of things depend on the position and arrangement of their particles, this idea is not consistently developed. For Empedocles, there are only four ultimate kinds of matter, qualitatively distinguished. The differential qualities of all other kinds of matter must, therefore, be due to the mixing of these four elements. Thus, the qualities of the four elements are unlimited, ultimate, and underived, but all other qualities must be founded upon the position and arrangement of particles of the four elements. This is the beginning of the mechanical explanation of quality. But to develop this theory fully and consistently, it should be shown not merely that some qualities are ultimate and some derived from position and arrangement of particles, but that all quality, whatever is founded upon position and arrangement, all becoming is explained by Empedocles as the result of motion of material particles. To bring this mechanical philosophy to its logical conclusion, all qualitativeness of things must be explained in the same way. Hence, it was impossible that the philosophy of mechanism and materialism should stand still in the position in which Empedocles left it. It had to advance to the position of atomism. The atomist therefore maintained the essential position of Empedocles after eliminating the inconsistencies which we have just noted. The philosophy of Empedocles is therefore to be considered as merely transitional in character. First, the atomists developed the theory of particles according to Leucippus and Democritus. If matter were divided far enough, we should ultimately come to indivisible units. These indivisible units are called atoms, and atoms are therefore the ultimate constituents of matter. They are infinite in number and are too small to be perceptible to the senses. Empedocles had assumed four different kinds of matter, but for atomists there is only one kind. All the atoms are composed of exactly the same kind of matter, with certain exceptions which I will mention in a moment. They possess no quality. They are entirely non-quantitative. The only differences between them They are entirely non-qualitative. The only differences between them begin being differences of quantity. They differ in size, some being larger, some smaller, and they likewise differ in shape. Since the ultimate particles of things thus possess no quality, all the actual qualities of objects must be due to the arrangement and position of the atoms. This is the logical development of the tentative mechanism of Empedocles. I say that the atoms possess no quality. They must, however, be admitted to possess the quality of solidity or impenetrability. Since they are defined as being indivisible, moreover, it is a question whether the atoms of Democritus and Leucippus were thought to possess weight or whether the weight of objects is to be explained like other qualities by the position and movement of the atoms. There is no doubt that the Epicureans of a later date considered the atoms to have weight. The Epicureans took over the atomism of Democritus and Leucippus with few modifications and made it the basis of their own teaching. They ascribed weight to the atoms and they only question is whether this was a modification introduced by them or whether it was part of the original doctrine of Democritus and Leucippus. The atoms are bounded and separated off from each other. Therefore, they must be separated by something, and this something can only be empty space. Moreover, since all becoming and all qualitativeness of things are to be explained by the mixing and unmixing of atoms, and since that involves movement of the atoms, for this reason also empty space must be assumed to exist. For nothing can move unless it has empty space to move in. Hence, there are two ultimate realities, atoms and empty space. These correspond respectively to the being and not being of the Eleatics. But whereas the latter denied in reality to not being, the atomists affirm that not being, that is, empty space, is just as real as being. Not being also exists. Being, said Democritus, is but nothing more real than nothing. The atoms being non-qualitative, they differ in no respect from empty space, except that they are full. Hence, atoms and the void are also called the plenum and the vacuum. How now in the movement of the atoms brought about? Since all becoming is due to the separation and aggregation of atoms, a moving force is required. What is this moving force? This depends upon the question whether atoms have weight. If we assume that they have weight, then the origin of the world and the motion of atoms becomes clear. In the system of Epicureans, the original movement of the atoms is due to their weight, which causes them to fall perpetually downwards through infinite space. Of course, the atomists had no true ideas of gravitation, nor did they understand that there is no absolute up and down. The large atoms are heavier than the smaller. The matter of which they are composed is always the same. Therefore, volume for volume, they weigh the same. Their weight is thus proportional to their size, and if one atom is twice as large as another, it will also be twice as heavy. Here the atomist made another mistake in supposing that heavier things fall in a vacuum more quickly than light things. They fall, as a matter of fact, with the same speed. But according to atomists, the heavier atoms falling faster strike against the lighter and push them to one side and upwards. Through the general concussion of atoms, a vortex is formed in which like atoms come together with like. From the aggregation of atoms, worlds are created. As space is infinite and thus atoms go on falling externally, there must have been innumerable worlds of which our world is only one. When the exaggerated atoms fall apart again, this particular world will cease to exist. But all this depends upon the theory that the atoms have weight. According to Professor Burnett, however, the weight of atoms is a later addition of Epicureans. If that is so, it is very difficult to say how the early atomists, Leucippus and Democritus, explained the original motion. What was their moving force, if it was not weight? If the atoms have no weight, their original movement cannot have been a fall. It is safest to say, says Professor Burnett, that it is simply a confused motion this way and that. Probably this is a very safe thing to say because it means nothing in particular. Motion itself cannot be confused.
It is only our ideas of motion which can be confused. If this theory is correct, then we can only say that the atomist has no definite solution of the problem of the origin of motion and the character of the moving force. They apparently saw no necessity for explanation, which seems unlikely in view of the fact that Empedocles had already seen the necessity of solving the problem and given a definite, if unsatisfactory, solution in his theory of love and hate. This remark would apply to Democritus, if not Leucippus. The atomists also spoke of all movement being under the force of necessity. Anaxagoras was at this time teaching that all motion of things is produced by a world intelligence or reason. Democritus expressly opposes to this the doctrine of necessity. This is no reason or intelligence in the world. On the contrary, all phenomena and all becoming are completely determined by blind mechanical causes. In this connection, there arises among the atomists a polemic against the popular gods and the popular religion. Belief in gods Democritus explains as being due to fear of great terrestrial and astronomical phenomena such as volcanoes, earthquakes, comets, and meteors. But somewhat inconsistently with this, Democritus believed that the air is inhabited by beings resembling men, but larger of longer life, and explained belief in the gods as being due to projection from these of images of themselves composed of atoms, which impinge upon human senses and produce the ideas of gods. Different kinds of matter must be explained in any atomic theory by the shape, size, and position of the atoms of which they are composed. Thus, atomists taught that fire is composed of smooth, round atoms. The soul is also composed of smooth, round atoms and is an exceptionally pure and refined fire. At death, the soul atoms are scattered, and hence there is, of course, no question of a future life. Democritus also put forward a theory of perception according to which objects project into space images of themselves composed of atoms. These images strike against the senses, like atoms are perceived by like. Thought this is true when the soul is equable in temperature, the sensible qualities of things such as smell, taste, color do not exist in the things themselves, but merely express the matter in which they affect our senses, and are therefore relative to us. A number of the ethical maxims of Democritus have come down to us, but they are not based in any way upon the atomic theory, and cannot be deduced from it. Hence, they have no scientific foundation, but are merely detached sayings epitomizing the experience and worldly wisdom of Democritus, that one should enjoy oneself as much and vex oneself as little as possible, seems to have been his principal idea. This, however, is not to be interpreted in any law, degraded, or sensual way. On the contrary, Democritus says that the happiness of man does not depend on material possessions, but upon the state of the soul. He praises equanimity and cheerfulness, and these are best attained, he thinks, by moderation and simplicity.